Good morning, children. Today I have brought you yet another story from Vistas, that is Enemy. As you know, it is the longest story you have to study. I divide the video lessons into 3 or 4 parts. At the same time, you have to remember one thing, that you have to go through the entire story, because cbse can ask questions, especially the short questions, from any of the events that described in the outline of the story. If you simply learn the outline of the story, it doesn't help you to score high marks in English examination. So you have to go through the entire story. And this video lesson series is an attempt to bring out the entire story before you. So you tune with me till the end of the series. Let us go. The Enemy, written by Paul S. Buck. A little bit about the author. Paul S. Buck was an American author. As the daughter of missionaries, she spent most of her life before 1934 in China. After returning to US, she started prolific writing and became an advocate of women's rights and minority development. She wrote widely on Asian cultures. Her acclaimed work, The Good Earth, won her the Pulitzer Prize, the greatest American literary award. And she was the first American woman author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She died in the year 1973. This is Pearl S. Buck. A little bit about the story, The Enemy. The story reveals the life of a Japanese doctor who saves the life of an American prisoner of war and proves himself not prejudiced nationalist. He takes risk with his career and life to shelter and save the war prisoner in his own house. This is the base on which the story is built. The beauty of the story lies in the dilemma the doctor has faced as a dutiful citizen and as a professional who is responsible as a lifesaver. So the dilemma of the doctor that he felt during the life-saving process of the POW, prisoner of war. The setting of the story. The story is set in the coastal town of Japan. It was the period of Second World War in 1941. Then the war was going on between Japan and America. The former attacked Pearl Harbor in US. Japanese were hostile to the Americans and ready to kill any American in their soil. So the story is set up in such a tense situation that remained in Japan in the year 1941 during the Second World War. Let us check the theme of the story. Humanism can transcend all man-made prejudices and barriers. So this story is set on the theme of humanism. Dr. Sadao upholds the ethics of his profession in treating a man in need. So he keeps the professional ethics as a doctor. He never weighs whether the needy an enemy or a friend. A doctor's profession, a doctor's ethics is to save the life. He doesn't weigh whether the needy is a friend or an enemy. The story is woven with the threads of fellow feelings, sympathy, tolerance, and moreover the feeling of the noble quality of humanitarianism. These are the threads by which the story is woven. Of course, we can see the threads of hatred, revenge, and nationalism in the story, but only to strengthen the threads of the other positives. Let us take a quick look at the characters. First, Dr. Sadao. He was a Japanese doctor who studied in America. Dr. Sadao's father, he was much concerned about his son's education, and he was a true patriot. Hannah, Dr. Sadao's wife, they met in America and married in Japan. Tom, he was the wounded soldier, the American Navy officer who was saved by Dr. Sadao. The old general, he was an ill old general. He had trust only with Dr. Sadao. Then an officer, a messenger of the general. Then we can also see three servants in Dr. Sadao's house, a gardener, Yumi, and the cook. Look at the story, The Enemy, written by Paul S. Buck. Before you read, it is this time of the World War. An American prisoner of war is washed ashore in a dying state and is found at the doorstep of Japanese doctor. Should he save him as a doctor or hand him over to the army as a patriot? This is the dilemma the doctor in the story faces. Let us go to the story. Dr. Sadao Hoki's house was built on a spot of the Japanese coast where as a little boy he had often played. So he was still living in the same house where he was brought up as a little boy. The low square stone house was set upon rocks well above a narrow beach. So the house was situated near a narrow beach that was outlined with bent pines. You can see an outline of bent pines around his house. As a boy, Sadao had climbed the pines, supporting himself on his bare feet, as he had seen men do in the South Seas when they climbed for coconuts. So when he was a child, he used to climb these pine trees, imitating when he went to see the people climbing coconut trees at the South Seas. His father had taken him often to the islands of those seas, and never had he failed to say to the little brave boy at his side, "Those islands yonder, they are the stepping stones to the future for Japan." This is a flashback of the story. When Dr. Sadao was a little child, his father used to take him to the South Seas, where he showed him the islands yonder there. Yonder means over there. He pointed that islands there and told his son that those were the stepping stones to the future for Japan. Then, where shall we step from them? Sadao had asked seriously. When he heard his father commenting about those islands there, he asked him seriously, "Where shall we get into from those islands?" What is the future that the father talking about? Where shall we get into from those islands? He wanted to know. Then his father would reply, "Who knows?" His father had answered, "Who can limit our future? It depends on what we make it." Then his father says that nobody can predict the possibility of our future. It has no limit or nobody can stop it. Our future is what we make it. He wanted to convey this message to his son. Come to the second page. Sadao had taken this into his mind as he did everything his father said. His father, who never joked or played with him. That was the old style of bringing up children. Fathers used to stand away from their sons. Like that, he was brought up. He never played or joked with his son, who spent infinite pains, but he spent infinite pains upon him. Infinite pains here means numberless careful efforts to bring up his child, because he was the only one son of him. Sadavo knew that his education was his father's chief concern. So Sadavo also knew his father's concern. His father's only concern was his son's education. For this reason, he had been sent at 22 to America. So when he was at 22, he was sent to America to learn all that could be learned of surgery and medicine. So to learn medicine and surgery, he was sent to America at the age of 22. He had come back at 30. And before his father died, he had seen Sadavo become famous, and not as a surgeon but as a scientist. Before his father's death, he became famous both as a doctor and as a scientist, because he was perfecting a discovery which would render wounds entirely clean. So now he was on the brim of a discovery, a new invention, that a medicine which would render wounds entirely clean. He had not been sent abroad with the troops. Dr. Sadavo was not sent with the troop because the war was going on between Japan and America, but he was not sent with the troop. The reason is, he knew there was some slight danger that the old general might need an operation. The reason is, the old general there in charge of his territory, he was in need of an operation for a condition for which he was now being treated medically. Now he was taking medical treatment. At any time, the old general needed a operation. And for this possibility, Sadavo was being kept in Japan. Because of this reason, Sadavo was not sent to the troop. Look at the next paragraph. Clouds were rising from the ocean now. The unexpected warmth of the past few days had at night drawn heavy fog from the cold waves. So it was a foggy evening. Sadavo watched mist hide outlines of a little island near the shore, and then come creeping up the beach below the house, wreathing around the pines. In a few minutes, fog would be wrapped about the house too. Then he would go into the room where Hannah, his wife, would be waiting for him with the two children. So he was just came out of the house and looking at the seas. Within a few minutes, it would be covered with fog, and then he would go back to the house along with and meet his wife there. She was with their two children. Look at the next paragraph. But at this moment, the door opened and she looked out, a dark blue woolen houri over her kimono. She came to him affectionately and put her arm through his as he stood, smiled and nothing. So he was thinking about going back to Hannah. It was at this time she came out in the Japanese dress and came close to him. He had met Hannah in America, but he had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. They met in America, but he never fell in love with her until he was sure that she was a pure Japanese. His father would never have received her unless she had been pure in her race. That was the reason behind it, because his father was so typical. He wondered often whom he would have married if he had not met Hannah, and by what luck he had found her in the most casual way. Because she met Hannah by chance. That was telling in the next lines. At an American professor's house, the professor and his wife had been kind people, anxious to do something for their few foreign students. And the students, though bored, had accepted this kindness. Sadavo had often told Hannah how nearly he had not gone to Professor Harley's house that night. So he had no plan to go to the Professor Harley's house on the day when he met Hannah. Many a time he thought about staying back from going to the Harley's house, because many reasons are there. Let us check what they are. Where the rooms were so small, the food so bad, the professor's wife so vulnerable. Because of all these reasons, he couldn't want to go back to Professor Charlie's house. But he had gone, and there he had found Hannah, a new student, and had felt he would have her if it were at all possible. But luckily, his mind changed, his decision changed, and he went there and he met Hannah, and he thought he would marry her if she were a true Japanese. Then one question here, what were the shortcomings at the American professor's house? Come to the next paragraph. Now he felt her hand on his arm and was aware of the pleasure it gave him, even though they had been married years enough to have 2 children. Many years ago they married, and now they had 2 children. For they had not married heedlessly in America. Heedlessly means carelessly. They did not marry at America. They had finished their work at school and had come home to Japan. And when his father had seen her, the marriage had been arranged in the old Japanese way. Although Sadavo and Hannah had talked everything over beforehand, they were perfectly happy. She laid her cheek against his arm. They did not marry in USA. They came back because his father was so strict in matters like this. And when his father was confirmed with everything suitable for his son, then the marriage took place in the old Japanese fashion. Look at the next paragraph. It was at this moment that both of them saw something black come out of the mist. So now they come back to the story, the live story. Both Dr. Sadavo and Hannah were standing at the back courtyard of their house. They saw something coming out of the mist. It was a man. He was flung up out of the ocean. Flung up means thrown out. And it seemed to his feet by a breaker. He was moving like his feet was fitted with some breaker. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, his arms above his head. Then the cold mist hid him again. They saw all of a sudden a black image that flung out from the seas. Who is that? Hannah cried. She dropped Sadavo's arm and they both leaned over the railing of the veranda. Now they saw him again. The man was on his hands and his knees crawling. They noticed him. The man was crawling in the beach. Then they saw him fall on his face and lie there. Then they saw that the man was falling on his face and lying there. A fisherman, perhaps, Sadavo said, washed from his boat. First, Dr. Sadavo thought that it would be a fisherman. He was washed from his boat while he was fishing in the seas. He ran quickly down the steps, and behind him, Hannah came. I am going to wrap up the first video lesson on enemy here. When Dr. Sadavo and Hannah saw a man coming out of the seas, and they rushed towards him. The later part of the story we will come with another video lesson. Goodbye.